Hello. Thanks for being here. It's amazing to have so many of you here on International Women's Day and surrounded by books written by women and celebrating the launch of The Female Gaze, published by women and containing all women. So the idea for The Female Gaze was partly inspired by a talk by Jill Soloway. She gave a keynote speech a couple of years ago at the Toronto International Film Festival, and she talks about the importance of the female gaze, why it matters, what it means to her. And it's brilliant. You should all look up the talk. I'm not going to rehash it now. But I did want to say one of the things that I think is really important about the female gaze is the fact that it's not one single thing. There's no single female gaze. It's polyphonic and it's intersectional and it keeps growing and evolving. There's no limit to the number of seats at the table. Everyone's welcome. And that's something that we wanted to do with this issue and keep doing for 5 Dials. And I've also been thinking about the idea of a canon and how it's not really possible to have a single limited canon when you want to make something that's infinite and keeps growing and keeps multiplying. But what you can have is everyone can have their own individual canon, a group of women who inspired you personally, who speak to you, who have molded how you see the world. So for me, that's women like Elena Ferrante and Andrea Arnold and Sharon Olds and Nina Simone and just many, many women, including a lot of the women who make up the 5 Dials issue that we're celebrating tonight, which is not a coincidence because I asked them to be a part of it. But I hope that when you read the issue, you will find that a lot of them enter your own personal canons as well. A lot of people went into making this issue, not least our wonderful contributors, but also some other people who I'm going to thank now. Our brilliant designer, Nina, and Kirsty at Visual Editions. We really couldn't have done it without you. It was amazing and an honor to work with you. Your patience, your vision, your energy. Thank you. Somewhere here. Also, Mariana, who gave us her joyful illustrations, which really pull the whole issue together. Zainab, who's not only a long-time 5 Dials contributor, but also made all of this happen and allowed us to launch our issue here on the best holiday of the year, International Women's Day. And last but not least, Simon Prosser and our founding editor, Craig Taylor. Sadly, both men, but still good people. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our first speaker. She is a winner of the White Review Short Story Prize and the Stylist Short Story Competition. Her debut novel, The Water Cure, is coming out this May. I'm very privileged to publish it on Hamish Hamilton. Please join me in welcoming Sophie Mackintosh.
Hi, I'm going to read a short story from the new magazine, and it's called What I'm Afraid Of, and it's essentially a list of fears. Some mundane, some less mundane. I am brushing my teeth and get interrupted halfway through. With my toothbrush held in my mouth, I fall and it knocks out several of my teeth bloodily. With my legs in stirrups at the doctor's, he says, "This will not hurt," but it does hurt. The television shows the latest disaster, melting, drought. You do not say it will all be okay. Lounging in a hot bathtub of water, the ceiling gives way. I cascade through, naked, into my neighbor's kitchen, where they're eating. I die of embarrassment, but also literally. The child steps onto a rusty nail, or puts dog shit in her mouth, or swallows glass. Every day a new twist. In the supermarket, troubling gaps in the shelves. No milk. Handwritten signs say, "Back in stock soon." The girl scanning my shopping is doleful. I take the shortcut through the alley I never use, and a shape moves in the shadows coming towards me. My shoelace catches in an escalator, my whole leg pulled down into sharp teeth and mangled. A handbook on surviving emergencies is posted through our front door. My partner hides it on top of the sink. You don't need to read that. A rat runs across our bed in the night, dense as a rabbit on my stomach. I watch my cervix on a screen back at the hospital, a rosy sun. It is spotted with what looks like mold. The doctor says, "You do not have to look, but I do." A vast and disastrous something. The landscape reconfigured. The army brought in to knock on all the doors to tell us not to be alarmed. The rat runs across the child's bed too. I never live in a foreign country or seize the day. One day I wake up and I realize that it's too late. The house is struck by lightning, which carries down the television aerial and explodes the screen. When I come home drunk, I leave the keys in the door and we are robbed and killed. The city is too dangerous. We have to move. The roads are jammed with people doing the same. In a strange hotel somewhere south, I say, "I love you," into the silence, but he does not return it. The child becomes very sick. There are no doctors left. We sponge her forehead with rainwater gathered in an empty bottle and try to remain calm. I fail everybody who loves me, and I always will. There will never be anything more beautiful than that one clear morning in a city in Germany years ago where we walked the streets for hours, which is to say, that was the best it got for us. We have to bury the child in the depths of a forest. We are hardly strong enough to do it. The ground is too hard. I have not kept the family together. I slice my finger down to the bone. I bleed in a way that doesn't stop. I am bleeding from everywhere. You leave in the night. I walk on alone with my rucksack of dirty clothes, drinking from streams. I die from a waterborne parasite, throwing up until my face is the color of wine. The siren rings out against the countryside, and there is nobody else around to comfort me, not even the army. Somewhere beyond the siren, there is a pack of wild dogs. I have never seen them, but I know they are there. One day they rip me apart. A man who is not you tells me to lie down in the festering dirt. I have to cover my face, muffle my breathing. I pretend not to be there, thinking only about wet leaves mulching under my palms between my fingers. We do not bury the child deep enough, and the ghost comes back every night. The sky is a strange and curdled thing, the incandescent flare of it behind my eyes squeezed shut. Then, later on, the rain clumped with ash. I am not allowed to lie down under it. I must keep walking and walking and walking. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. That was great. So next, I'm going to introduce Deborah Smith, who is the founder of Tilted Axis Press and the joint winner of the Man Booker International Award for her translation of Han Kang's The Vegetarian. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hello. So tonight I'm going to read an extract from a translation by the other main author that I translate, aside from Han Kang. I translate another woman. I only translate women somehow. Called Bae Sua, and I've described her sometimes as the Bjork of Korean literature. She even kind of looks like her a bit. Other times as kind of a cross between Clarice Lispector, the Brazilian writer, and W.G. Sebald, both of whom she also translates into Korean herself. Although she only speaks German, not Portuguese, so she translates Clarice Lispector from the German translation. I'm going to read a tiny, tiny bit of Korean, just so you understand what it sounds like, and then I'm going to read the bit from the 5 Dials. I'm also not going to read the same bit, because I can't find exactly where it is, but hopefully nobody here is going to know that that's true. 전직 여배우 아나미는 손에 판명으로 큰 둔지에 오디오 공연장의 2번째 계단에 앉아 있었다. 그녀는 혼자였다. 이해의 내용은 아직 아무에게도 알려지지 않았다. 조명이 거진 공연장 내부는 흐릿한 물에 참기는 듯 보였다. 사물들이 부드럽게 와해되고 있었다. 그 안에서 모두의 존재가 불분명하고 초반쯤 불투명했다. And so the book in Korean is called 알려지지 않은 밤과 하루, which means either what I've translated it as at the moment, undisclosed nights and days. It could also be untold nights and days, inscrutable nights and days, other kinds of nights and days that are sort of... Korean likes to use passive constructions a lot, and it like puts the adjective before the noun in a way that makes more sense in Korean and is more natural. It was entirely down to the director that Ayami started taking German lessons. Her second day working at the theatre, the director had told her about a woman he'd known since university, who'd got married straight after graduating, spent time as an exchange student with her husband in the same city as the director, but hadn't been able to complete the course. Now back in Korea, she didn't have any kind of steady job, and, after an unexpected divorce a while ago, urgently needed to start earning some money. She'd hurriedly applied for a position teaching English at a cram school, but because she was older and didn't have any experience in this line of work, they were reluctant to give her a by-the-hour contract. The money she did earn there wasn't enough to cover her living costs, so she also gave private lessons at home, not just in English, but also in French and German. One of Picasso's girlfriends earned a living teaching French to American women in Paris after the two of them broke up, the director said. It must be a very classic step to take, one that transcends various eras. Which girlfriend? Ayami asked, but she'd already made up her mind to take the director up on his suggestion and go for private German lessons. Or French, she wasn't really bothered. At any rate, she was savvy enough to realize that it didn't actually matter, as neither was likely to be of any real use. Fernand Olivier, the director said. Ayami didn't know the name. The director's friend was small, slight, and unfailingly elegant, even down to the long hair whose ends reached her waist. Her face, though, was severely marked from a childhood bout of smallpox, making it impossible to even estimate her age on a first meeting. Her skin was mottled, almost as though it had been burned. She had a strangely rolling walk, like a boat bobbing on gentle waves. She generally kept to the shadows, but when necessary would extend her right hand, its pale skin unmarked, into the light. After the divorce was settled, she'd moved to an area 3 or 4 bus stops away from the audio theatre. Although the neighborhood was technically downtown, its location up a steep hill and general air of dilapidation meant the rent was fairly cheap. The woman occupied a one-room dwelling at the very end of an alley where the sunlight never quite reached. It was quite a walk up the hill from the nearest bus stop. Ayami went there for a 90-minute German lesson every day after work. Rather than having an actual conversation, they preferred to sit and listen to each other read from a book. Perhaps this was why, despite taking lessons for almost 2 years, Ayami's German never showed much signs of improvement. The German teacher always made them both a cup of tea. Hair pulled back from her forehead, she put her small brown feet up on a chair and sipped at the hot tea, hunched over like a monkey. She fished out the piece of lemon peel from her tea and rubbed it on the back of her hand. The German teacher was like a shadow glimpsed through frosted glass. When she wordlessly reached out to pass Ayami her tea, her sound right hand was a pale gleam emerging into the light of a midsummer evening. One time their reading was interrupted by the sound of a radio coming from within the room. "What's that sound?" Ayami whispered. "The radio." The German teacher's voice wasn't dissimilar to the one coming from the radio. "Why switch the radio on just now?" "It must have come on by itself." "Well, switch it off again." "I can't, it's impossible." "Why?" The switch is broken, you see, so it turns itself on and then turns itself off again." "Just pull the cord out then." "I can't, it's impossible." "Why is it impossible?" Because I'm frightened of electrical sound." "It's frightening, like gas or knives or lightning." "Ah, I see." Ayami looked at the German teacher and nodded. They both returned to drinking their tea. Beads of sweat formed on their foreheads. The sole window opened directly onto the wall of the dead-end alleyway, thereby serving absolutely no purpose whatsoever, and the humid air collected in the house's dark interior, so dense you could almost have swept it up with a broom. The scent of yellow sphagnum wafted from the fishbowl — the goldfish had died long ago — to mingle with the sweet smell of the mold blooming near the bottom of the walls. The house might as well have been a temple dedicated to the worship and propagation of tropical heat, heat which swelled like a bog within those four walls. Certain agonizing phantasms were bred in this place, a mental state known as monsoon disease. Given that the single narrow room had neither air conditioning nor even a fan, if you opened the window, hot air heavier than a sodden quilt rushed in, clagging your pores like the wet slap of raw meat. But with it closed, the oxygen would quickly evaporate, disappearing at a frightening rate until the air was filled with nothing but heat. But Ayami probably wouldn't have a tropical holiday this year, because the theatre would be closing down before the usual holiday period, and the possibility of her finding another job before then looked slim. A while ago, an unidentified node, that was the doctor's term, developed in my left breast, the German teacher said, her whispered voice seeming to come from within a semi-concealed black mirror. There was a moment's silence. It's actually quite common for people my age, she added. Ayami asked if this was true, if, that is, it was really just a node, something trivial, nothing to worry about. That's right, it's true, the German teacher nodded. It's just a common thing, but it wouldn't feel real to a young person like you. Ayami had never once thought of herself as particularly young. Now, with unemployment staring her in the face and not much time left before her 28th birthday, she was even less inclined to feel that way. In life, there is a wound within the soul, slowly encroaching inwards like leprosy. The German teacher read from the book, her voice utterly toneless and devoid of all emotion. The German lessons progressed, with them each reading a page per lesson from a novel in German. Their current text was The Blind Owl.
Thanks. That was great.
You're welcome. Thank you, Besuwa, for writing that.
So we were talking a bit before about your own writing and how you've been thinking about the connection between translation and feminism, very conveniently. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Oh, it would be convenient if my thoughts had cohered into some kind of thing. I'm writing for the first time something that I'm not translating. A new publisher asked me to write a sort of book-length essay about translation. And I thought, yeah, that sounds great. I write articles about translation. How hard can it be to write a slightly longer thing about translation? And have, since realized how agonizing it is to try and write something yourself, and how the constant crushing, is this of any value? Why would anybody in their right minds read this, let alone pay to read this? Which I don't normally get when I'm translating, especially because I translate sort of some of the most incredible authors working today. But the link between sort of translation and feminism, or at least translating women as a woman, partly seems to be around translation having sort of traditionally been seen as a feminized profession, which, as you can probably guess, means a devalued profession, a profession that is underpaid. The translator is sort of seen as a kind of handmaid who is expected to be humble or invisible before the work of the author, and the author, historically is usually coded as male. And so, of course, what we want to read and know about is what the author, great man, has said, not what some nobody, who's usually a woman, has felt about it. So that sort of plays into the reception of translation, particularly around this sort of discomfort that people have with translations being an interpretation, being something subjective. I was sort of surprised when my published translations came out that some of the sort of criticisms were, it's subjective, it's an interpretation, it's creative, which to the people saying those things were, I had done this specific, strange, different thing as a translator, and this was wrong and this was bad. Whereas to me, saying those things is kind of like saying the sky is blue, Language is made of words. Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Do you think that plays in at all to your decision to, well, maybe it's a coincidence to translate women, that sense of evening that power balance?
I think luckily I don't know, maybe I didn't have to think about it consciously because South Korea is maybe unique in all the sort of countries whose literary scenes I know anything about, in that it seems to be dominated by women. I know, isn't it great? It's, the winners of the major prizes, the shortlists of all the major prizes are almost all more than 50% women. So when you're looking around for amazing people to translate, you just fall over amazing women sort of everywhere you go. But I think, maybe it didn't need to be conscious, but it was maybe the kind of thing I was looking out for anyway, because I became a translator around the same time that Joanna Walsh launched the Year of Reading Women. And I think before that, if you'd have asked me, do you read a lot of women? I would have said, yeah, of course I do. And it was sort of seeing those statistics and then actually like counting them up on my bookshelf that made me realize that, wow, I actually read more men than women. Because if you're not consciously thinking about it and sort of doing your quotas initially, then that's just what will happen. I don't have to do that now. I just read more women than men naturally, because I've maybe initially, made myself look beyond just what's being thrown at you by reviewers or bookshop displays or stuff like that. But I probably gravitated towards women just naturally.
Yeah. The other thing that I was thinking about listening to that is the kind of precision of the language and how it feels like every word has been placed really thoughtfully and chosen really carefully. I guess that must just be a kind of feature of all translation, but could you talk a bit about that, the kind of trying to find the right words and how you go about it?
Yeah, sure. How you go about it, God. Dictionaries. Dictionaries, and then just playing around with things for ages. I think probably the reason that I wanted to be a translator in the first place, or thought that I would be good at translation, was that I loved writing, but I loved writing sentences. I loved, the rhythm and the tone and the context of a single word and the sort of mouthfeel of it. Not so much structuring things or plotting things or making characters, which is now why having to try and write something myself is the worst thing ever. If somebody else could just write this book and then I could translate it, that would be great. I could tell them my ideas and then they could write it. And maybe anybody who is bilingual knows this anyway. I didn't know any of the language until I started learning Korean, so it sort of only came to me then that a lot of the time we use language in a not really very precise way, because we kind of know what each other means by the context or the just general conventions of something, or if you're speaking, you could be using gestures or tone of voice or whatever else. But then when you're translating, you really need it. You need first of all to know exactly what it means in the original, and then you need to make sure that it means that primarily and not sort of accidentally anything else. Especially English, so many words have sort of secondary meanings kind of ghosting behind them, or other connotations which almost never map onto the connotations or secondary meanings of that word, equivalent word, if that's such a thing, in the other language. So it's almost never sort of the obvious or equivalent word. It has to be, something else that you're not going to read and even subconsciously have this other thing that you shouldn't be thinking about.
Thanks. Well, I can't wait to read your book-length essay that is a book.
Oh, don't say that. Pressure, pressure, no pressure.
Okay. So it's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker. She's a writer, poet, and journalist, previously picked as one of the Hospital Club's emerging creatives and among Speaking Volume's 40 Stars of Black British Literature. And her debut poetry pamphlet, Titanic, is available to buy here tonight. So please welcome Bridget Minamore.
Hi. It's lovely to be here. I won't talk for too long. This is a short story, my first short story, which feels very weird. Haven't read my first of anything for a while. But it was a poem that didn't want to stay as a poem. And after 2 years of adding and adding and adding, I just thought maybe it's not a poem after all. So it's in 5 dials. Thank you very much for pushing me to finish this. I have published an extract because it's turning out to be a proper, long-ish short story. And altogether it's called Swallow. So this is the first part. Swallow. Elizabeth's name begins, like all names, as a weight. Her mother spots it one day, sees it perched on the corner of a church pew, and despite knowing this was coming, knowing it couldn't stay away for too much longer, the appearance of Elizabeth's name still shocks her mother at first. Really, Rebecca thinks? Really? Rebecca always imagined she wouldn't be like Elizabeth's grandmother, wouldn't be the sort of African woman to find the name for her first daughter in an English church. Rebecca's own name was an acknowledgement of Yaz status as one of the early Catholic converts. She was a heathen, those first priests said, but the good Lord's sanctuary was something Ya found easy to adopt. From the early days of their marriage, Ya's husband would squeeze the flesh that folded on the backside of her stomach until it was purple and sore and bruised beneath the surface, reveling in the feel of his fingertips kissing one another despite the barrier of her skin. But when the missionaries who were told there was a young woman in the village who can understand anyone eventually, even you white men, no one knows how, but she has a gift. You keep her 40 days and she will know enough words to insult you. That was the morning Ya was taken, 22 years old and newly pregnant, from her husband. Ya did not see the man again, not even in the eyes of her daughter, who, conveniently, looked nothing like him. The day that marked 5 months since Ya's husband was bribed with 2 younger wives in exchange for his first was the day he died from the venom of a snake bite as he walked through the undergrowth on the outskirts of the village. Was the day Ya was taught the English word for widow. Was the day Ya was asked if there was a Twi word for bastard. Was the day Ya spotted Rebecca's name crouching impatiently on the altar of the hastily built Catholic church in the village square. It's a sign, Ya's cousin said. You have no husband now, and this same day you see your child's name and it's a white one. Ya smiled. Some 4 decades later and 3,000 miles further, Rebecca spots Elizabeth's name on the corner of a church pew. She is startled, yes, but not surprised. An English church, just like her mother. Still, a name is a name. Rebecca had been so desperately grateful in that way only not yet mothers can be, to hear her unborn child's heartbeat the week before, that she hadn't given too much thought as to when its name would finally come. But here it was, perched on the corner of a pew, an as yet undefined shape with no real colour. Wait, that's a lie. Like the names Rebecca would glare at when her friends announced their pregnancies 5, 10, even 20 years ago in some cases. This name is almost the shape of the country she is standing on. The name reminds her of displacement, of movement, of learning. You still say words funny sometimes. Don't be embarrassed though, loads of you lot can't speak English proper, from her work colleagues. In those early days, cleaning inner city offices in the light of the early morning. Elizabeth's mother, Rebecca, her name is Rebecca, begins to smile. It's happening. In a couple of months, her daughter will finally come to be, and here's the proof. Here is an almost name making its presence known. Of course, Rebecca had been in possession of an almost name that belonged to a future child before. The first time back home, 19 years old and in hindsight far too foolish to flirt or understand what her collarbones did to grown men who should have known better than to know her, or unbutton the 6th button on her best dress, or realize what a name appearing meant until she was bleeding in the Colliboo teaching hospital bathroom on Wednesday afternoon. The pinprick-sized name, so small she hadn't even seen it yet, had followed her in, suddenly growing bigger and bigger as Rebecca, with horror, understood that the future child she didn't even realize she had been carrying was lost. An hour passed, maybe 2. When it had become apparent the future child had left her, totally, had stained itself across the soft skin of the inside of her thighs, Rebecca cleaned herself up with her tights quickly taken off, soaked in cold water, dressed herself, closed the toilet seat in the cubicle with the least graffiti on the walls, and sat down. The name was now enormous, twice the size of her head perhaps, and rested heavily in the palm of her hand, kissing the brown lifelines with the weight of lost promise. Rebecca tried to stop thinking of all the names she could have given that future child, if only to stop the damn thing getting any bigger, but she couldn't block them out. And with every "what could I have called you" child, the name rose like tea bread bought from the roadside in her village back home. Instead, she knew what it was time to do. She was scared, yes, but there was nothing else for it. The name would not let itself be left here or disposed elsewhere, and she had heard enough stories of women losing their minds, stealing other children's names because they had successfully abandoned a past almost name and grew to regret it. So, opening her mouth wide, wider than she thought possible, wider than possible under any other circumstances, Rebecca swallowed her miscarried past future child's almost name in one suffocating, heavy gulp. There is a pain that only a mother who swallows the name of a past future child can understand. The name and the pain sticks to the inside of her chest, punctures her heart through her left breast. Don't move, don't breathe too much, Rebecca. It'll hurt more if you do. That's what Ya told her daughter when Rebecca finally turned to her for help. It was 2 weeks later, and the pain had grown so much she was sure she was losing her mind. All Rebecca's mother did was squeeze her. Ya did not chastise her daughter, nor did she make sentences with the word sex, or shame, or older, or stupid, or married, or wrong, but instead squeezed Rebecca so long, and so hard, and so tight, and so honestly. The name suddenly came back up through Rebecca's gullet and fell to the kitchen floor with a silence like the sound of a baby who has cried for too long. Look at it, Ya said. Look at it well, well. That is your past future child's name. You try to swallow it, but you must never swallow the name of a dead future child, or even, God forbid, a dead child, because the name will stick to your heart like the snail on the side of a crock pot, or public humiliation, or glue. When your future children die, and they will die, because the women in our family are cursed to never be mothers of many, you must never swallow the name straight away. Keep the child's name in your mouth. Let anyone who speaks to you see it sitting there. And one day, when you are so used to the feeling of it and the shape of it and have stopped caring about strangers seeing your grief peeking through that gap in your front teeth, and the name has become small enough to swallow accidentally, then and only then will it be time to swallow the name. Rebecca listened to her mother. When Ya finally stopped squeezing her, Rebecca picked the past future child's name up from the kitchen floor, wiped it against her mother's dress, spat away a speck of dirt, and placed it in the corner of her mouth. At first, the name was so big Rebecca could not speak for the mass of it. She returned to college immediately, her determination an acrylic nail, hard-aged and pressing into her palms and refusing to be yanked away from the bed it had found itself in. It was awkward, of course, to be so full of grief for a past future child at such a young age, but Rebecca remembered her mother's words and refused to hide it or herself. For weeks, the name stayed the same size, bulbous and hulking, casting strange shadows when the sun was low in the sky. It contorted the shape of her body, made her pause before saying hello. But then, one day, Rebecca realized the past almost name was getting smaller. The guilt at this knowledge made it grow again, only slightly, but then, once again, the name started to shrink. It took a year in the end. A year for the past almost name that belonged to Rebecca's past future child to become so small. Rebecca no longer even thought of its mass in her mouth. Ya had warned her the time was coming, told her daughter that it was important not to keep the name in her mouth for too long. Keep the name in her mouth forever, because those women find themselves with mouths full of lost possibilities, and that's enough to make you mad. And so one morning, when the sun felt bright and her grief at the lost possibility of a future child had settled into something still painful, but far more manageable inside her chest, Rebecca thought to herself, this is a thing I can swallow. Thanks.
Thanks. That was incredible.
Oh, thank you.
Really beautiful about grief and motherhood and female relationships and memory. How did you come across the story?
So I'm a poet usually, and have been trying to write a play because I started writing in theatre, and I started looking at grief. I'm really obsessed with grief. My family's Ghanaian, and we're a weird culture in that we don't talk about death, but are really obsessive about it. If you ever want to Google Ghanaian coffins, that's a fun thing to do. They have these, like, genuinely, they're like 2 meter wide. You can get them in shapes, so you can get like giant bananas or pencils. I want a pen. Seriously, like a fisherman can be buried in a fish, and they're incredible. And my family is very Ghanaian in that way. Like, we're very over the top. My grandmother died a few years ago, and the funeral was like this 2-week extravaganza, I guess. They take like 8 months to plan. It takes longer than most weddings to plan funerals. And you have like thousands of people, and because someone's old. And ever since that happened in 2014, the funeral, which was on Valentine's Day, that's the sort of thing you do. You're like, let's bury someone on a holiday. I just have been writing about grief and wanted to write this play and was procrastinating, basically. And had this other poem about names. It's called For Black Girls with White Names, and it started off with the line that starts off here, I guess, like your name's a weight, and I was talking about my name, and I used it as lots of getting out all my feelings about having this sort of, I guess, racially ambiguous name, and it just grew and grew and grew, and suddenly I thought maybe it's a story. So this is actually the first 4 lines of like a 30-line poem so I don't know how long this short story is going to be. It sort of just morphed, and some bits, I had the first sort of page for a long time just sitting, and I knew who the people were. And I got really close to them, I guess, Rebecca and Elizabeth, and and in the rest of the story, I've sort of finished part 2. I think there are 4 altogether. It mostly looks at Rebecca, the mother, and then Elizabeth, and their sort of good bad relationship. Grief has been a thing. I just like to, I don't know, I think it's good to talk about it, isn't it? Good to explore it in literature and in theatre and in prose.
So apart from the length of a short story as opposed to a poem, did you encounter differences in the form, things that you felt you could express in ways that you haven't explored in your poetry? Because I think there's a real rhythm to how you write, where you can see the lineage of your poetry, but also it's different.
Is it just one giant poem? I should have separated it and done like a Claudia Rankine. That would have been the plan. I don't know. It feels more pretentious to be writing prose. I'm not sure why that is. I think maybe because poetry should probably feel more pretentious, but I've got so used to it that anything else just feels really wrong. I'm not sure, but I naturally write very prosy poetry anyway. So I was really surprised at how easy it was. Once I knew what was happening, I could just write stuff. And I also don't write, I don't know if any of you know my poetry, but this is all, I guess, magical realism in this idea of like personifying. I've never written anything like that at all in poetry. I barely, even like metaphors, very basic metaphors, are things I rarely use. And so this was, I don't know, so that poem was something like my poetry publisher was always like, oh, like, where's this come from? This one rogue poem that we can't put in the book. I don't know, it's a weird one. You probably can, I'm not sure, I think it's good that you can hear the poetry in it, maybe. I'll take it as a compliment.
It's definitely good.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't know, it just sort of came. And so now I'm like, maybe I should read more magical realism. So like ordered loads of books online that I haven't read yet. But hopefully I will. And I also love short stories, I should say. I actually read short stories more than anything else. I'm not sure why I've never thought to write one before. But I think the short form is, I'd argue, the most impressive to me. Just getting something so beautiful. And when I was at university, I used it as an excuse to just read loads of short stories. Most of my favorite writers are short story writers. But I'd never thought to do it myself, I think. And especially, you know, there are so many short story writers who write with a voice that I think I was trying to capture here, I guess. Not necessarily in terms of similarity, but just a sort of letting things ramble like I ramble, because it's an obvious, and you can't really do that in a poem, can you? So maybe I've found my form. I'm not sure.
And just finally, kind of thinking about the connection between grieving and the female experience, and how that's often kind of work that's given to the women of the family. Is that something you were thinking about?
Yeah, definitely. Especially in Ghana, where most of the ritual around the funeral process are women. So there's this bit where the women of the family come to like wash the body, and you have to go to someone else's house. There's this whole thing about like, and this is I think a very tribe-specific thing, like my mum's tribe, where you have to ask a neighbour to host to let this all happen in the house, but you ask the women. The men aren't involved in that. So the women go and ask and other women, and no one ever says no, despite how invasive that must be to have hundreds of people and a dead body in your house. Yeah, I was just thinking of that, and so often depictions of grief are female, aren't they? But also, even I find myself with this feeling more touched, I guess, that thing, like a guy is crying, oh my God, and sort of was trying to get myself out of that headspace that somehow that being feminine in grief is somehow too much, and also I think with the sort of British grieving is so bad. I think it just is so like stiff, and yeah, I've always really hated going to English funerals. I just never feel like I've had any catharsis, which is the sort of key component of a Ghanaian funeral, or actually so many other cultures that aren't British. A friend and I were talking about Shiva. Her family's Jewish, and she had to go and then sit Shiva in Poland, and it was all this big thing, and I was like, God, that's so, you know, you physically go away and you come back. And to bring it back to women, I guess, this I always feel very female. Is that a bad thing? Maybe, when I'm grieving. Maybe it's a stereotypical thing, but it's how I've always felt, and I was trying to unpick why that was, and unpick what it is about feminine grieving, i.e. like things like losing children or having a mother dying. Is that a spoiler? I guess so. You know, that woman, that female connection, when that's broken off, what that does to you. And for my mother, that was she's one of like 10, but that still completely destroyed her, losing her mother. And I'm an only child, and so I've sort of worried about that my whole life, you know, having that connection severed. So yeah, that's a very roundabout way of answering your question, I think, if I have. But yeah, I was thinking about all of that when I was writing.
Thanks, that does make sense.
Okay.
And I think I would just add that I don't think it's a negative thing to feel to feel yourself very female in that experience, because I think it's a real privilege to grieve for someone, and really part of the human experience.
I completely agree. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Abi Andrews, another outstanding debut novelist, whose book, The Word for Woman is Wilderness, is also out now and also available to buy. So please join me in welcoming her.
I'm going to read something that I wrote just for this edition of $5. So it's called Singing Over the Bones. Forest. Greedy souvenirs of euphoria, waking up in a wooden cabin every morning to a different mountain. Pastel orange or cloud draped like cloak and hat, or cut to pieces by light, or disappeared completely by sky. Walking alone, deep in woods, excited and defiant to foresight. You're not supposed to, there are madmen, and besides, wouldn't company be better? Sitting on a log in a forest clearing, full of crows. A feeling of having come home, a spiritual home. Is this how the pioneers felt? Intoxicated by America's limitlessness. But this is a thefted feeling. My European blood spilled blood here. How then to tread a careful visitor, and how to write it? A feminist writer makes for an uncomfortable flaneur. How to write place when women and nature have both been non-autonomous subjects of the male gaze, noting down your contaminations rather than listing your conquests. A small community of people, off-grid in the forest, Era shows me how to tell the dog fur, with bark so thick-pitted you can dig your fingers into it. She has charmed fingers. Her garden bursts its fences, spilling languidly over. If you sing and talk to the plants, she says, they do better. Bees draw invisible topographies between her flowers, and hummingbirds hover at them like the quivering tips of a conductor's baton. There is a chapel bent from the vines of a flower particularly attractive to the hummingbirds, inside which you can lie in the grass and look up, trying to imagine as they assume position, beak inside bud, that they too are still, tapping into the timescales of hummingbirds, tricking yourself into convergent perception. As if their hotter heartbeats weren't drumming out a world in more complex nuances, their perception a high-speed camera, as a flickering zoetrope. Air is asking, is what I'm doing too removed? Is it right to be carving out a good life in the wilderness, going after the white male pioneer trope, absolved of the incumbencies of wider society, when there's so much to be fighting in the cities? The exclusion of women from the wild stems from a narrative that casts women as inherently social in reductive evolutionary terms, having natural instincts inclined towards care. At the basis of this is the dichotomy of individualism as masculine, collectivism as feminine, but collectivism is now a moral necessity. It was women I found leading restorative work, and where they were opening outwards rather than building islands, offering respite to those doing the work of resisting. This is why Aerostarting invited in woofers, which is worldwide workers on organic farms, if people don't know, feeling the tug of tendrils, pulling people in and reaching out. Her sharing of knowledge and the restorative powers of the land itself are like the hummingbirds and bees that weave a web in flight into and out of her garden, taking bits of it off, impregnating the plants with transferred pollen, inextricable from the flourishing and abundance. Desert. I walk from the mud house in the red sands for a deep arroyo, stepping over plants bent by the memory of annual rain floods. I sidestep a tarantula that's crossing the dry riverbed. She's rusty red, as though her brittle hairs were made of fine strands of copper. She has none of the unnerving jagged speed of an ordinary spider. She first runs a little away from me and then lies still with the desperate faith of small creatures, their last-ditch trust in destiny, lying in plain sight, awaiting fate to be decided by the larger and differently witted creatures. Maybe I'll be confused, or maybe my eyesight will blunder on a still object, I will think her a stone. Or perhaps it's a try at pathetic vulnerability. By offering herself up, I won't be able to bring myself to kill her, which I won't, because now I love her. Arroyos are dry, ephemeral riverbeds that fill with mountain and rainwater once a year, shocking the desert. The red soil of the high desert can't brace against the water, whose rushing torrents have carved scars into the mud and sand. But the plants have evolved so that their seeds can only germinate in this turbulence. They must be roughed up by rushing sediment, then quickly send down roots deep enough to survive the thirst that follows. Pam works with rocks to help the land become more resilient, after the erosion caused by the building of railroads in gold mine days. We build one-rock dams, carefully seeking out rocks that will interlock perfectly to redirect the water on the dirt roads that links them and their neighbours to the town. A neighbour, a loud man in a 4x4, pulls up and an altercation begins. He's been shoving aside her rock dams with a tractor he's using to bring the road into abeyance with brute force instead, undoing hours of her hot, heavy work. He says he's sorry for spoiling her pretty rock gardens. Pam tells me that she hates people, loves the earth. Did she move to the desert to run away or towards people? She chose this piece of land because it needed love, but she also sends her tendrils outwards. She runs her home as a land restoration learning centre, teaching the vigorously tender work of laying rocks and shaping earth. There are no islands. We're implicated by the wider world. In hand with this is the question of living in severed bliss at the same time that Trump is eroding native land rights and shrinking wild spaces, the UK having already saturated them, making a claim to the seclusion and individualism that has always been the privilege of men, at the expense of other female and non-human allies, who suffer the brunt of patriarchy equally, if not more. Forest. Sleepless in the straw bale house, because without seeing her I know she's there. Strange how you can feel poison in the room, a heavy pendant around the neck. Suspended still on her silken trapeze, in the ceiling corner a metre from the bed, Black Widow. From the shine of my head torch, she slinks into a small hole tucked into the corner, shying away from the light like she knows she is for darkness. She moves in a similar slow way to the tarantula, as if speed might give her away or debase her. To my surprise, I slip into the nonchalance of exposure immediately. In fact, there's something comforting in the way I can feel her emerge by darkness. The vividity of her blackness is beautiful, but she warns you, asks for respect, but asks it gently. Redwoods are only found in California and one small valley in China, but they used to span the planet. Their thick bark is almost impervious to fire. Could they be a tree to survive the inferno then, now that California is burning? Natives of the coast knew how to use destruction to nurture, burning the trees to remove excess foliage, which causes severe fire if uncontrolled. They lived seasonally inside living hollow trunks. A forest fire decimated the surrounding land but stopped at the Peace Pole, which marks the boundary to sacred Native American land, now under the care of Elena. She offers it as a safe space for California's fire victims, for LGBT souls, and she holds the place open for the Native people who, for whatever reason, found themselves having to sell it. They have traditional ceremonies here still and keep a close relationship with their caretaker. Women and Two-Spirit people are invited to an Inipi ceremony. I pro fears of appropriation, but we were invited, and the ceremony will be led by Lakota women. The ceremony involves sitting inside a dome made from willow and hides, hissing rocks, the ancestors in a central pit. Lakota and English prayers and songs are said in the cleansing hot darkness. It's a purification ceremony, heavy trauma channeled around, but we're burning down to nurture. We pray for individual traumas, some of the others so intense I can't stop crying, and earth traumas. It's dreadful and it's hopeful. The firekeeper tells us as we crawl out of the tent that we're brand new babies. Inipi means to live again. I come across a story in Elena's library. It tells of a hairy old woman who's questionably human, who collects bones to sing over them. And as she sings over the bones, they begin to flesh out. The muscles of the dead creature that grew them gather together, and the animal's form becomes erect, a skin and then fur forming, tail unfurling like a waking fern, shudders passing through the creature as its lungs unstick and raggedly fill with air, wheezing like an accordion. It opens its eyes and runs away towards the horizon. While running, its hind legs elongate until it is no longer able to run quadrupedal. Its forelegs bend at the elbows as its fur drops from its skin. And then it is a laughing woman, and she runs naked through the forest, the desert, the forests, and never stops running.
Thanks, Abi. That was great. So you talk a lot about the relationship between the wilderness and the idea of nature and womanhood. Nature has typically been characterised as female, and that's quite problematic. Could you talk a bit more about that in your novel more generally?
Well, I was interested in the fact that it is like women are so often reduced to their biology and then they get negatively associated with nature. So a kind of relationship is meant to, the negative aspects are meant to be sort of irrationality and being more in touch with nature, whatever that means. But then at the same time, all of the canonical writing that's about experiences of nature is all written by men, and the relationship that's written about in those terms is one that's usually either of conquest or it is about communion, but it's just those two things at once, like being associated with it but also being excluded from it. So I just wanted to think about why that was.
You have that line about, is it okay, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but talking about, is it okay to kind of to want to retreat from the world and create this sort of utopia or the hermit life when there's so much going on in the cities that requires us to stay and fight for it. Is that something that you kind of feel yourself?
Yeah, I think just in terms of, so again, going back to the traditional male canonical writing about the wilderness, it's usually about a single man in solitude, communing with nature. I think I just wanted to look into why that's not really applicable anymore and why we should not be sort of putting forth this experience of nature in those terms as the ideal, when to cut yourself off from society and go and live into the wilderness when there is so much going on that you should be fighting for is probably not that morally good anymore.
Yeah. And in terms of the piece, it's really great kind of triptych structure. How did you come to write it? I sort of read it as kind of auto-fiction. Maybe that's not right. Or how much is it fiction? How much is it experiences that you've had yourself?
This one was actually less fiction. Like so the novel was completely fiction, but this was based on trips that I'd taken. But it was, I think I took the pitch really literally, and I was just I found it interesting, but also coincidental that I went on this trip, and everywhere that I stayed, it was women that were leading these projects. So yeah, I just wanted to do them a little sort of tip my hat to them a bit.
Have you sent the piece to any of them?
I did, yeah. I asked them all if they were okay with it before which is a bit weird because I've never written anything that's non-fiction before about people, so I felt a bit strange doing that, but they're all okay with it, I think.
Well, they all come off very well. I want to go and meet them all.
Yeah, they're all great. They're amazing people.
Great, thanks. So our final speaker of the night is Deborah Levy. It's my great pleasure to introduce her. She's twice Man Booker shortlisted, author of Hot Milk and Swimming Home, among many other novels and short story collections. And she's going to give us a completely exclusive preview of her new book, which is the second in a autobiographical trilogy. It's called The Cost of Living. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Thank you, Hermione. And I've got a little tribute to you. So Hermione sometimes has to write the copy for my books, and it's very hard to nail my books. And she does a brilliant job. And I was thinking about you doing that today when I chanced upon some copy for Picasso's new exhibition, which is about to open. And so what I've done, Hermione, as my tribute to you, is just to replace my name with Picasso's. This is verbatim. This is real copy, except I've swapped names. To my misfortune and maybe my delight, I place things according to my love affairs, Deborah Levy once said, alluding to the essential yet complex role her lovers have played in informing the work of one of the 21st century's most prolific writers. Levy devoted herself to 6 prominent lovers, with countless other mistresses moving in and out of her life. Each created an indelible mark on her evolving practice, becoming immortalized in her many novels, plays, and essays. So I'm just going to launch straight into The Cost of Living. I guess the only thing that I'm going to say is something has happened to the narrator. She has had the most humiliating experience, and she went to a cafe, she knocked back a coffee, and she's taken out a bottle of essential rose oil, and she's putting it on her wrists. And then she just has a riff on something. Does serenity smell like a rose? A rose is kind-hearted. A rose is consoling. The rose is the empress of the pinks. Perhaps a rose is the empress of the blues. When Bessie Smith sang about not being able to live in a house that was falling down, that's how I felt about my old life. It is also the song that James Baldwin listened to one winter in the mountains of Switzerland, where far away from Harlem, he wrote, "Nobody knows my name." Actually, I had no idea what serenity felt like. Serenity is supposed to be one of the main characters in old-fashioned femininity's cultural personality. She is serene and she endures. Yeah, she's so talented at enduring and suffering, they might even be the main characters in her story. It was possible that femininity, as I'd been taught it, had come to an end. As a cultural personality, it was no longer expressive for me. It was obvious that femininity, as written by men and performed by women, was the exhausted phantom that still haunted the early 21st century. What would it cost to step out of character and stop the story? There were many variations, of course, including corporate femininity, in which women with male bosses were still required to dress in a way that gave a nod to the boardroom and the bedroom. How was it possible to be erotically and commercially switched on for your boss all the time? That sort of femininity does not wear very well. After a while, it starts to show the dirt. No, there were not that many women I knew who wanted to put the phantom of femininity together again. What is a phantom anyway? She is a delusion, an illusion, a societal hallucination. She is a very tricky character to play, and it's a role, sacrifice, endurance, smiling, cheerful suffering, that has made some women go mad. This was not a story I wanted to hear all over again. It was time to find new main female characters with other talents.
Thanks, Deborah. Thank you for my tribute. It was surreal. So I wanted to talk a bit more about the themes in the cost of living. You're sort of reaching for a kind of freedom and trying to understand what freedom would mean for a woman and what it means for you. Could you talk a bit about where you got to with that? Tell us the answer, please.
I have to tell you that my books are much cleverer than I am. So I'm just going to read the blurb at the back. To separate from love is to live a risk-free life. What's the point of that sort of life? I was living in the republic of writing and children. I was not Simone de Beauvoir after all. No, I had got off the train at a different stop, marriage, and stepped onto a different platform, children. She was my muse, but I was certainly not hers. Yet we had bought a ticket for the same train. The destination was to head towards a freer life. That is a vague destination. No one knows what it looks like when we get there. It is a journey without end, but I did not know that then. So that's my answer to the question. And it sort of is a journey without end, and actually so it should be. You know, it's not really even the sort of main core of the book. I think the main core of the book is to try and understand what it's like to write our lives as we feel them. Because I know that every single person in this room, if you wrote your life as you really feel it, it would never be boring. It just wouldn't. And but it's a hard freedom to take, and we can sort of just try and see what happens. And the cost of living is also a lot about writing. It's about the artist Francesca Woodman. That there's a show opening at Tate Liverpool of her work. If you ever manage to see it and you don't know it, I think you'd like it very much. She was 22 when she was making small photographs. She's from America, of herself always disappearing into the wallpaper, disappearing into the floor, becoming a spectre, a blur. And the thing is that when we look at her photographs, we want to find her, because she's always trying to make herself disappear. And so those sort of images really influence me when I write, because I'm also always trying to find her in my books.
So one of the things that kind of strikes me about this whole idea of seizing the freedom, even though it feels scary, is a kind of risk in the creative act and putting yourself out there, exposing yourself, maybe to yourself, being honest with yourself about who you are and what you want. And I think that's something that runs through your fiction a lot as well, the kind of exposing yourself or like understanding what's really going on in your own mind.
Yeah, in a way, but I think it's just more in fiction and in non-fiction. I think it's the same thing, is trying to figure out who wants what and what's stopping her from getting it. That kind of thing, to sort of work out what she really desires. And it's very hard to claim our desires and much more relaxing to mock them. So whether it's fiction or non-fiction, when I write a female character into the world, and a memoir is also a female character, it's a sort of I that is close to myself, but not quite myself. There's this moment when you write a female character into the world, and then suddenly she turns around and she stares back at you. Because writers are readers as well. So you've got this, and when that happens, you know that the work has sort of become three-dimensional, and that it's you know, that it's going to be okay. So that's the kind of gaze. The gaze is well, this is a sort of 100-stare gaze, isn't it? But you know, being here. If it's a bit like when you write, all your characters suddenly stare back at you. They go, "That's a load of rubbish. I don't agree with that at all." And then you say as a writer, "Well, maybe you're right." And I think that returning of the gaze is just part of fiction and non-fiction that has enough dimensions to keep readers interested.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay, that's it for tonight. So I just want to do another big round of applause for all of our wonderful contributors.